Hello, hello, testing. I just now realized that the mic was on mute. Somebody let me know when you're hearing sound. I'm got a brand new mic, and I totally forgot that it's got a mute button on it, and so it was muted. I'm guessing probably in the next few seconds somebody's going to chime in and say audio's good. So I'll do my introduction again. Good evening to everybody. Thank you for joining us tonight. It is our midweek Bible study in the Gospel of Mark. We are in Mark the 9th chapter, as you can see down there. Get your Bible cranking. Let's get ready to study in the Word of God as we look at the life of Jesus and the things that He taught there. We've got all our thumbs ups that we're good to go with the sound once again. You will notice that I have Josh Harris with me tonight. Josh, glad to have you.
Good to be here.
All right. And he said earlier that he's got big shoes to fill because he's stepping into the slot that Glenn originated for us last week. So we're going to be discussing, hopefully, and having some good thoughts here from this section. This is just an eventful section in Mark's retelling of the life of Christ. And so I hope that you're ready to go in Mark chapter 9. Let's read here in verse 1. As I said last week, this is not a great chapter division. Really, verse 1 goes well with what was talked about back in chapter 8. But let's grab verse 1. Mark 9, verse 1. Josh, hit us with verse 1.
And he said to them, "Assuredly I say to you that there are some standing here who will not taste death till they see the kingdom of God present with power."
All right, so let's be reminded that in chapter 8, Jesus had been talking to the disciples about the kingdom, trying to help them to understand some kingdom ideas. And one of the big things that Jesus taught and articulated in the most plain terms back in chapter 8 was how that kingdom was going to come into existence, how Jesus was going to become a king, and that was going to be through his death, through suffering, which was really quite different than the way that they had envisioned it. I think they foresaw that the kingdom was going to come with, all kinds of fighting and going to overtake the Romans, and that's how the Jerusalem is going to be brought back to prominence once again. But Jesus says, nope, the way this is going to happen is I'm going to be arrested, I'm going to be beaten and tortured, I'm going to be killed, I'm going to be buried, and then I'm going to rise from the dead. That's how all of that is going to take place. But I am going to be a king, and there is going to be a kingdom. With all of that in mind, then, he then makes this statement in chapter 9, verse 1, that some of you guys right here, right now, who are within the sound of my voice, you're going to see that this is going to happen in your lifetime, the ushering in, the establishment, the inauguration of the kingdom of Jesus Christ. And I want us to just kind of make a point out of this verse before we look at the main chunk here of chapter 9. And that is that this verse is really helpful for us in understanding something that's very different than what's taught in a lot of the religious world today. And that is that in much of the religious world, the thought is that Jesus later on is going to come and he's going to establish a kingdom. That at his return, that there's going to be the rapture, that there's going to be a period of tribulation, that there's going to be the 7 years of that, and there's going to be Jesus coming, and he's going to establish on the literal throne of David, in the literal city of Jerusalem, a literal throne here upon this earth, and that's when the kingdom is going to be established. That Jesus wanted to the first time, but the Jews rejected him, so now he's going to come back, and he's going to give it a second go, and that's when he's going to establish the kingdom. You run into some real problems with that when you read verse 1, don't you?
Yeah, I've long said that for me personally, that's actually one of the most offensive denominational doctrines, just on the implication that Christ failed by that logic.
Yeah.
And it's such a focus on that physical kingdom. They were looking back to the throne of David and just all of the glory that he and then Solomon, showed in their physical kingdom, and that's what they were looking for. But we know it's a spiritual kingdom.
Yeah, the doctrine that we're speaking of here is premillennialism, and I really entertain the thought of putting a premillennialism chart on the screen, but the screen's not big enough to contain most of these charts. There's so many layers and complexities to them. Jesus says that his kingdom was going to be in the lifetime of many of those folks that were standing right there listening to him. And so here's what it kind of comes down to. Either Jesus was sorely mistaken about that, or he was an outright liar, or, option three, Jesus was telling the truth. And the people who propagate premillennial doctrine, they're the ones who are mistaken. And I think actually option three is what we're actually looking at. That the kingdom did come. The image that I've included on the screen with that verse, that's supposed to be kind of a representation of the day of Pentecost, when the Holy Spirit fell upon the apostles, and then, of course, the preaching of the gospel that happened on that day, and the establishment of the church kind of in earnest. I think that's the inauguration of Christ's kingdom that we see happening. That's going to happen in Acts, the 2nd chapter. That's all I want to say about verse 1. There may be other comments that folks may end up putting into the chat, and if you do have comments anywhere along the way, we're going to try to get as many of those as we possibly can, as is usually the case. But let's now then shift to verse 2, because evidently between verse 1 and verse 2, about a week has elapsed, and Jesus is now wanting to kind of follow up, I think, on some of the things that he's allowed the disciples to have some time to digest these thoughts, digest some of the things that he's articulated, and now he wants to show himself in a very special way. So let's read a little bit here in Mark 9 and in verse 2. Josh, if you don't care, just read verses 2 and 3 to set us up.
Now after 6 days, Jesus took Peter, James, and John, and led them up on the high mountain apart by themselves, and he was transfigured before them. His clothes became shining, exceedingly white, like snow, such as no launder on earth can whiten them.
All right, so the disciples have had basically a week to digest the poignant things that Jesus had taught in chapter 8, the things about the kingdom, the things that he had to say about his death, burial, and resurrection in very plain terms. And these three apostles that he invites to come up with him into this mountain kind of comprise what it seems like kind of Jesus' inner circle, if you will. We've already noticed Peter, James, and John kind of getting a special moment with Jesus earlier in the book of Mark when they went into Jairus' house and the raising of his daughter. He brought those three guys in particular. We're going to know, of course, that later on in the garden when Jesus is going and he's praying in the Garden of Gethsemane, that he takes Peter and James and John with him then. I don't think that we need to read anything into that as far as thinking that somehow those three guys were more special than the others, or that those three guys were somehow elevated above the other nine. I think it probably just speaks to the fact that Jesus was he was human, and he just gravitated toward certain people and had closer friendships with those folks. And I just think that's the case with Peter, James, and John. The guy that I always think about when I see Jesus with these three guys is I always think about Andrew. Because Peter, James, John, and Andrew were, it seems like, kind of all fishing partners together. And Andrew's always kind of left out of this group. We don't ever hear him complaining about that. But it's these three guys, and what these three guys are going to get to witness here is truly kind of it's a once in a lifetime sort of event and sort of moment. And he wants to reveal himself to these guys in a very special way. Can we just maybe notice something very quickly about the setting here? It says that Jesus took them up into a high mountain. Mark doesn't specify. In fact, none of the gospel writers specify which mountain that is. There's actually two or three different mountains that he could have chose from what we can tell from that time in Palestine. You'll notice there on the map, there's Mount Meron, there's Mount Tabor. I'm probably going to be inclined to say that this might have been Mount Hermon. That's up in the top right corner of that map there. And the reason I say that is because back in chapter 8, the last known place where Jesus and the disciples was in Caesarea Philippi. And you'll notice that Caesarea Philippi is right there kind of at the foot of Mount Hermon. So geographically, that maybe makes sense. The other thing, too, is Mount Hermon, and you might not be able to make that out because the print is so small with some of the details of the size of Mount Hermon, but it's got a peak of over 9,000 feet. And I point that out because that would have provided kind of some solitude that maybe smaller mountains would not have. Kind of be in an area, be in a place where he can be alone with these guys. There at the end of verse 2, it says to be by themselves. Jesus is not wanting to give this manifestation of himself to everybody in all of Galilee. It's just for this very limited crowd. So Mount Hermon seems like a likely candidate for the mountain where this took place.
The air starts getting pretty thin,
Yeah.
up above 9,000 feet. I mean, that's certainly there would have been some solitude to be found there, if not some snow as well.
Yeah.
depending on when it was.
And I totally forgot. I've got a picture that I meant to put on the screen of modern day Mount Hermon, and it's got snow on the top.
Yeah.
And so, not sure. This may have still been kind of in the springtime and the summertime, and so maybe there wasn't the snow if you're trying to picture all of this in your mind. But nevertheless, Jesus has this opportunity to show himself in a special way. The word that's used at the end of verse 2, when it says that Jesus was transfigured before them, if you were to look up the Greek, it's the word metamorphos, which is, of course, where we get our English word metamorphosis. And we think about, the caterpillar changing into the butterfly, this dramatic change from one thing into something completely different. And that is what's taken place here. The words that Mark uses, and you could pull in Matthew and Luke's account, and they give some additional verbiage. Probably the words don't even fully do it justice. I put this image up here on the screen, and that picture probably doesn't do it justice either. But the words that are used there, that his clothes became radiant, intensely white, as no one on earth could bleach them. I think one of the writers mentions about, no launderer could make them this white. Piercing almost. The radiance, the glow of Jesus was just unlike anything that had ever been seen, certainly by these three fellows, ever before.
Definitely implicates just the complete cleanness in the spirit form that can't be obtained in the worldly flesh, basically. I
Yeah.
think.
Definitely. And Jesus, of course, would have been the purest person to ever walk the face of this earth. So there's maybe some of that going on in manifesting himself in this way. What these three guys are getting is they're getting a glimpse of the glory that Jesus possesses. I've often thought, so here's these guys, they've been with Jesus for the last, couple of years by this point. Familiarity kind of starts to set in. And you get used to people, and they no longer seem as special to you as maybe they did in the beginning. I always think about if I met a celebrity or a famous athlete, I would be really awestruck in the beginning, but after hanging out with them maybe for a couple of days, a few weeks, especially a few months, well, I would get really, really comfortable with them, and I'm elbowing, and we're telling jokes, and it would be very light. And I kind of wonder if maybe there would have been some of that at times with the disciples. And in some ways, an event like this for Peter, James, and John, it would have kind of snapped them back to reality. Whoa, who are we in the presence of?
Wouldn't be unlike, becoming really good friends with your boss.
Yeah.
Sometimes you kind of forget that relationship. You're ribbing each other at times and joking and having a good time, but you might need to be reminded of the authority that that the boss has from time to time.
That's exactly right, and we hold on to that thought, especially about the authority that Jesus has and how that's going to be articulated here. But yeah, they're getting as much as is humanly possible for a human being to do. They're getting reminded of the gloriousness of Jesus, that he is not just a man. He is indeed the Son of God. Peter confessed that just in the previous chapter when he said, "You are the Christ." The other writers make mention that he says, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." So they verbally acknowledged that, but they needed to be reminded of that and see that, maybe even in physical form to some degree. They're not going to be able to see the fullness of Jesus' glory, passage in the Old Testament that says, no man can see God and live. They're not going to be able to fully see him in all of his glory, but they're going to get a bright and vivid reminder that's going to stick with them, so much so that Peter actually will write about this in the book of 2 Peter. He'll write about this later on in his life and how this event was so vivid in his mind. Actually, as soon as I'm saying that, Dad's got the comment on here. 2 Peter chapter 1, talking about how that we were eyewitnesses of His majesty on the mountain, and what we saw there was just seared into our minds. And Peter then uses that experience to tell his readers and his audience that the Word of God that we now convey to you, this is why you can be sure of that. Because we saw that guy. We saw the living Word, and the things that we're writing to you, you can be confident in what we're saying. They didn't just see Jesus, though. That's the other thing here. That's the other thing that makes this a unique event, because verse 4 goes on to say that there were some other folks on the mountain. So, Josh, hit us with verse... well, just go ahead and grab verses 4, 5. Do 4 and 5, and let's stop right there.
And Elijah appeared to them with Moses, and they were talking with Jesus. Then Peter answered and said to Jesus, Rabbi, it is good for us to be here, and let us make 3 tabernacles, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah.
All right, so we've got Elijah and Moses, and I do think that those two fellows were brought here or invited or however that happened. I think they're placed there intentionally. You know, there's lots of huge heroes and figures in the Old Testament that could have been brought to this scene. Daniel is a giant to me. Joseph is a giant to me. But I think the reason that Moses and Elijah are chosen here is because Moses is the consummate representation of the law, and Elijah is the consummate representation of the prophets. So you have here the law and the prophets. And of course, Jesus, even in the Sermon on the Mount, talks about the law and the prophets. That was often kind of a synonym for the Old Testament, the law and the prophets. Glenn's already kind of pointed out here that one of the things that is going on here as Jesus is talking with Moses and Elijah is that in Luke's account of this great event, they are talking to Jesus about his departure. They're talking to him about his death, burial, and resurrection that he had been trying to talk to the disciples about in the previous chapter.
And perhaps even giving him encouragement, knowing that he was in anguish over knowing what he was going to have to go through.
Yeah.
And who better to get direct encouragement from in that moment? Yeah,
those guys, Moses and Elijah, they had both been through the ringer. And so, they're able to kind of speak very candidly with Jesus about those things. There's so much about the conversation. Imagine getting to just kind of be a fly on the wall like Peter, James, and John were, and getting to just maybe overhear a little bit of Jesus and Moses and Elijah having a spiritual conversation. I would have loved to have been there for that. I've said repeatedly that in heaven, I hope that there is a version of YouTube in heaven where God lets us just see played out the real life, what happened in various events in the Bible, because this is one of those scenes I'd like to see. I'd like to see what the transfiguring looked like. I'd like to overhear the conversation that these three guys had, and to be able to be privy to all of this. I wonder if Peter, James, and John are getting the significance of all of this, or if maybe they're just so awestruck by, that's Moses, that's Elijah. These are guys that they would have studied and read their words, all throughout their upbringing, and now there they are. I don't know how they knew that was Moses and Elijah. I don't know if they had name tags on or Jesus introduced them. I don't know exactly how that worked. But there they are. And those guys, like I said, they would have been kind of the representation of the Old Testament. If you're putting together kind of the Mount Rushmore of the Old Testament and the Old Testament covenant, Moses and Elijah is going to be on that Mount Rushmore. And the words that they spoke and the way that they led people and the way that they tried to get God's people to where they needed to be, those guys were very authoritative in their time and in the role that God had for them at that time. And that's key, and I want everybody to hold on to that thought because of what gets said here in just a couple of moments. But here are these guys representing that law. And Peter's response in all of that, verse 5, is, Rabbi, teacher, Lord, this is great. This is wonderful that we're here. It should not surprise us at all that Peter is the one to speak up here and to start saying stuff. And he then makes this suggestion that I don't know entirely what Peter meant by this. He says, let's make 3 tents, one for you, one for Moses, one for Elijah. Other translations say, let's make 3 tabernacles. And so there's kind of some uncertainty. Does he mean let's set up kind of 3 monuments, sort of, to kind of commemorate this event? Is it possible that it means kind of like tents, like let's set up some shelters so that we can hang out for even longer? You know, let's prolong this event as long as we can so that we can learn from each other and talk even more, and Moses and Elijah can just, have a nice little vacation here with us, and we can glean some stuff from them. I don't know what Peter meant, and the funny thing is, I don't think Peter knew what he meant because of what's said in the very next verse. Look at verse 6. Verse 6, for he did not know what to say, for they were terrified. And this to me is just the most Peter thing, where he just feels the need to be saying something, and so he just says it. Words, they're coming out. I don't know what I'm saying, but I got to say something. And I think we've all probably had moments like that where there's either just some uncomfortableness, or in this case, kind of just the terror and the awesomeness of the event that I got to say something about this. And he just starts blurting stuff out.
We're not too many verses removed from chapter 8 where, Peter offered almost a rebuke to Jesus of, Jesus talking about his suffering, and he said, that can't be, Lord, and Jesus rebuked him in return. And so it's not his first rodeo, so to speak, on a well-intended misspeak, so to speak.
Yes. And I think you're right that his intentions were pure. Whatever he was suggesting here, I think his intentions were pure. He probably thought this was a good idea. However, we're going to see here that in this instance, it's almost as if God the Father himself is going to kind of give the rebuke here, or at least put Peter in his place so that he understands what he really needs to be getting out of this moment and this event. Said a moment ago, Elijah and Moses kind of would have been viewed as kind of authoritative figures according to the, in Old Testament times and under the Old Covenant. But in this moment here, God's wanting to signal that there's been a changing of the guard, and that needs to be made very clear. So let's read verses 7 and 8 if you don't care, Josh.
And a cloud came and overshadowed them, and a voice came out of the cloud saying, "This is my beloved Son, hear him." And suddenly when they looked around, they saw no one anymore, but only Jesus with themselves.
All right, so this instance here in verse 7 is, if you're keeping score, this is the second instance in Mark's gospel in which God voices his approval vocally and audibly from heaven for his Son. Of course, the first of those instances was back in Mark chapter 1 when Jesus was baptized, and God said something very similar there about, this is my beloved Son in whom I am well pleased. On this occasion, though, what God is doing, it seems to me, is he is validating the teachings of Jesus as being of the highest and most supreme authority. Yes, there was a time where if you needed to find out how you needed to live and what God wanted you to do, you listened to Moses. There was a period of time where if you were out of favor with God, you weren't doing what you should do, and you needed to figure out how to get back to God, you listened to Elijah and what he had to say. But now there's been that changing of the guard, that passing of the torch, whatever kind of metaphor that you want to use. Jesus is the guy. This is God saying that emphatically from heaven, and not just for Peter's benefit, and not even just for Peter, James, and John's benefit, but certainly for us today, even as we read these verses. And this helps, I think this would help with a lot of things that are amiss in the religious world even today. Think about some of the practices and things that are done in other religious groups where they will cite Old Testament passages as being kind of the authority for why we're doing what we're doing. The use of instrumental music in worship comes to mind. How many times have you been talking with somebody about that and some of the problems with that scripturally, and the person will point out, well, over here in the Old Testament, They used instruments of music, instruments of music in their worship. Read the book of Psalms. David played with a harp, and there's all kinds of stuff in the Psalms about that. Well, again, if we were under the old covenant law, absolutely. That's exactly, we want to listen and hear them at that time. But that's changed. I want to know what Christ's covenant says. I want to hear Jesus' covenant and what it has to say about that. Tithing would be another one. You hear so much about tithing today. Again, if we were under the old covenant, I want to hear Moses. I want to hear Elijah. I want to hear what they had to say at that time. But God says here, listen to Jesus. You listen to my son and listen to what his covenant has to say about these things.
They're all in a cloud, and just an extremely miraculous moment. God removes the cloud while simultaneously saying, hear him.
Yeah.
In other words, now you're going to start listening to him instead of these guys.
Yeah.
And it's not really instead of, but it's, a transition, as you say, kind of a changing of the guard.
That's right. Jesus, I always want to be careful with my words about this. Jesus did not come so much to just do away with the old law. And we say that, and I understand what we mean when we say that. Probably the better thing to say, though, is Jesus came to fulfill. And that's what he said about himself. I've come to fulfill all the law and the prophets. And so now that Jesus has fulfilled all of that, and of course then by his death, his burial, and resurrection, he now has brought in and ushered in a new covenant, and that clarity is evident. I do like what you said there about the cloud, and it's very clear who it is that God is putting his seal of approval on once and for all. And like I said, it wasn't just for those guys right there. It's for us even today as we consider whose authority that we're seeking in the things that we do and how we live, how we worship, how all the things that we do as followers of Christ. It's kind of interesting. This event, I don't know how long it lasted. That's maybe one of the other things I'm real curious about. Did this last for hours on end? Not entirely sure. But there at the end of verse 8, that suddenly looking around after God speaks, everybody's gone. Moses and Elijah are gone. God's no longer speaking from the clouds. It's just Jesus there, presumably kind of just back in his normal form before them. I don't know. I'd like to be in the mind of those guys in that moment, especially as they start to come down from the mountain.
Had there been any doubt or uncertainty to this point, I think, this was God using the opportunity to make it certain in their minds.
Yeah.
And certainly there had been those moments after some of the miracles and how quickly they might sort of seem to lose their faith up to this point. And I think, God didn't have to use this, but he certainly gave them a great opportunity here to really seal their faith that, Jesus is the Son.
Yeah. Linda's got the comment here about, the visible manifestation there of Moses and Elijah on the mountain, that one of the things that does convey is that there is life beyond the grave. And these guys stand as a great example of that for all time. Of course, Jesus makes that point in his teaching as well, that how God speaks, that he says, I am the God of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. And the point being, it's talking about present tense. He's not God of the dead, but of the living. And here's Moses and Elijah from beyond the grave making an appearance there on that occasion. I dealt with this in a Q&A back last month or whenever it was, but I do think that the fact that Elijah and Moses were there, and seemingly Peter and James and John and Jesus all recognize them, for me, kind of lends itself to the idea that we will recognize one another in heaven. That's a commonly asked question, and the Scripture does not give definitive answers about that. But passages like this do kind of give support to that, at least in my mind. I think there's lots of other reasons, but this is a good place to kind of make that point as well.
If not visually, at least in spirit. They knew what those guys did.
Yeah. Verse 9. So let's notice what ends up happening as they then make their way down the mountain. Verses 9. Let's just go ahead and grab that whole section, 9 through 13, if you don't care, Josh.
Now as they came down from the mountain, he commanded them that they should tell no one the things that they had seen till the Son of Man had risen from the dead. So they kept this word to themselves, questioning what the rising from the dead meant. And they asked him, saying, Why do the scribes say that Elijah must come first? And then he answered and told them, Indeed, Elijah is coming first and restores all things. And how is it written concerning the Son of Man that he must suffer many things and be treated with contempt? But I say to you that Elijah has also come, and they did to him whatsoever they wished, as it is written of him.
All right, so they're talking about this as they come down the mountain, and Jesus explicitly tells these three guys that I don't want you to be telling others what you've seen. Now, I don't know if that would have been, limited to just those, you keep it between you three. Possibly maybe there's an allowance there for sharing this with the other 9. I don't know. But certainly beyond that, it seems like Jesus does not want things spoken about this just yet. And he gives it with the qualifier, until the Son of Man has risen from the dead. So here's another explicit mention, if we're kind of keeping score. This is number 2 now, at least explicitly, where Jesus says to the disciples about himself raising from the dead. Which probably begs the question in our mind, why didn't Jesus want them to talk about this right away? Such a awesome event. I mean, and if ever you're going to use the word awesome, this event would be an appropriate place to use that word and it be used properly. Why would he not want them to go around speaking about this awesome event to other people just yet? If we're looking at a timeline, we're within this final year of Jesus' life. So he's basically saying, without telling them, I want you to hold on to this information for probably a little less than a year now before you say anything. And so we might be wondering, well, why is that? I've got an idea, maybe even a couple of ideas. Do you have any ideas before I share mine?
Well, I think just on a big sense, if you think about the scribes and Pharisees, their whole MO is to take down the credibility of Jesus. And as soon as these guys go back, and obviously we can see later on that there are conversations that are going on with the disciples and the scribes and the Pharisees. And so they go back and say, yeah, Jesus, this guy that you guys are trying to kill the credibility of, he literally just hung out with Moses and Elijah on the mountain. They're going to consider that blasphemy, and they're going to use that as their case against him much sooner than Jesus, would have liked, for whatever the reasoning would be for that.
I think that's a great point. And it really kind of probably even feeds into to one of the thoughts that I had. Imagine them going down the mountain and they start telling other people, you're never going to believe what we saw. We saw the most glorious manifestation of Jesus. I mean, it was the closest thing we've ever seen to God himself. It was amazing. It was beautiful. It was, again, glorious is just the word that keeps coming to mind. Imagine them painting that picture for people like the Pharisees and the scribes and so forth. But then in just a few months, what's going to happen? Well, what's going to happen is that same glorious Jesus that they had talked so gloriously about, he's going to be stripped of his clothing. He's going to be slapped against a plank of wood. His hands are going to be nailed into it. His feet are going to be nailed into it. He's then going to be hoisted up above the earth in one of the most cruel, humiliating, ugly, detestable scenes that anyone has ever seen. Is that a picture of glory? Well, no. I mean, that's the picture of it's less than a common criminal. It's vile. Crucifixion in the mind of well, even to us today, but especially to people then and to a Jew. I mean, that's just the lowest of the low. It's reserved for the most awful. That just gives more fuel for the fire of, yeah, look, there's your glorious king. Look at all the glory of that guy up there. What a joke, what a crock. But imagine, though, if they hold on to that information until after those events, until 3 days later when he is risen from the dead, and then word begins to spread like wildfire where they're telling other people, Jesus has been raised from the dead. And let me now tell you about a moment from several months ago when I saw just a glimpse of this glorious Son of Man. It makes sense. It all fits together now. It just would be totally incongruent with what Jesus knows is going to happen to him and how he's going to be treated in just a short little while. And of course, as we've already kind of pointed out, Peter later on, some years later, when he's a little bit older, probably wiser, he's an elder in the church. When he pens 2 Peter chapter 1, he's going to point to this event and speak of it in those kinds of poignant and authoritative terms, that is the glorious resurrected Lord that we saw, full of authority, his supremacy above everything else. Paul's chimed in here with a comment about the apostles' question. People who practice Judaism today are still waiting for Elijah because they don't understand the meaning of God's word. It is part of their yearly ritual and ceremony. And that is the segue here to this section that they ask the question about, what is this that the scribes often say? All right, so Jesus has clamped down on them talking about this this issue here, and then about this rising from the dead thing. So that then causes them to ask this question in verse 11. Why did the scribes say that Elijah must first come? And clearly what's going on here is there's a failure to fully comprehend and connect all the dots about who that prophecy is speaking of. I had it up here on the screen, but I'll put it back up here again. They're referencing something that the scribes and others who would have been acquainted with their Old Testaments would know about, and that's from Malachi chapter 4, where it's stated there, prophesied, that before the day of the Lord can come, Elijah is going to have to return. And so that caused a lot of question in the mind of a Jew that, all right, well, where's Elijah? And when's he going to come? And are we looking for him here? And what's this all about? Maybe the disciples are asking this question because they just saw Elijah up on top of the mountain. So they're thinking in terms of Elijah a little bit. That was a common question of the day. We might be wondering too, like, well, yeah, that's a good question. What's this all talking about here? We have the benefit, though, of all four Gospels. And in Matthew's Gospel, Jesus kind of spells it out. And Dad's already kind of chimed in with the comment. I'll put it up here on the screen. In Matthew chapter 17, this is Matthew's account of this event, that as they were coming down the mountain, Jesus said, don't tell anybody about what you've seen till the Son of Man's raised from the dead. They then asked the question about Elijah first coming. Jesus then gives the same answer. Then verse 13, then the disciples understood that he was speaking to them of John the Baptist. So Jesus said, Elijah's already come. And they're probably at first thinking, well, how can Elijah already come? I mean, did he come back in the flesh? Did he come back from the dead? Was there something along those lines that maybe we just missed it? No, what Jesus was, he's talking kind of, metaphorically. Elijah had come in the sense that John the Baptist was after the spirit of Elijah. And that's what Malachi was talking about in Malachi chapter 4, it's talking about John the Baptist, this guy who would come in the same spirit as Elijah the prophet. And there would have been a lot of similarities between Elijah and John the Baptist. They both wore the weird clothing. They were both out in the wilderness a lot. They both went and confronted kings and told them unpopular things. Elijah went to King Ahab and said, you're the troubler of Israel, buddy, not me. And of course, John the Baptist went to King Herod and said, you're married to somebody you ain't got any business being married to. They're piecing it together finally that, oh yeah, that's talking about John the Baptist. And so what that then means, just practically speaking, is that means that since that event has taken place, since Elijah's come, John the Baptist has come, then this day of the Lord business, we're much closer to it now than maybe we first realized. This is happening. And so to Paul's comment that, yes, there are still practicing Jews even to this day in modern Judaism who are still waiting around for Elijah. I don't know if they're waiting for some physical reincarnation of Elijah. If you know your Old Testament, that Elijah, went up into the whirlwind and, the chariot of fire and the whole 9 yards. But yeah, there is still a failure to understand that and understand what Jesus meant by all of that and what the prophets were speaking of all along.
Either verse 1 was true or it wasn't.
Yeah.
It just goes right back to that, how it's going to come soon. And Can't you just kind of see the scene here of the religious leaders of the day? It's easy for us to think of, the scribes and Pharisees in a really negative connotation, but these were the religious leaders of the time. And you can imagine in moments where Jesus was maybe away and he gets with the disciples and they're saying this really convincing thing, because that is literally the last couple of verses in the New Testament, that we're quoting from there. And how easy it would have been for them to say, well, yeah, you guys are saying Jesus is the Messiah, but Elijah hasn't even come yet. And how convicting and maybe even confusing that could have been, to those disciples. And we can see that today, even from today's modern religious leaders that many people in the world hold in respect, and how they can twist Scripture to try to make it fit, an agenda, basically.
Yeah. And people still even today are kind of waiting for this thing to happen and this thing to happen before we know that the end has finally come. This was a prophecy that was clear that if the last thing that needs to take place before the Messiah takes his position as the king and the kingdom is here, if the last thing that needs to happen is this coming of Elijah, well, Jesus says, hey, Elijah's already been here, and his suffering, the suffering of Elijah in the form of John the Baptist, once again is kind of a preview of the suffering that Jesus himself would endure when he ends up being delivered over into the hands of these people. Let's grab this last little section, because I don't think there's a lot that needs to be belabored out of this last little section before we close. Beginning in verse 14, let's just let's break it up a little bit. Verses 14 through 20. Josh, read that if you don't care. 14 through 20.
And when he came to the disciples, he saw a great multitude around them, and the scribes disputing with them. And immediately when they saw him, all the people were greatly amazed, running to him, greeted him. And he asked the scribes, "What are you discussing with them?" Then one of the crowd answered and said, "Teacher, I brought you my son, who has a mute spirit. And wherever it seizes him, it throws him down. He foams at the mouth, gnashes his teeth, and becomes rigid. So I spoke to your disciples that they should cast it out, but they could not." And he answered them and said, "O faithless generation, how long shall I be with you? How long shall I bear with you? Bring him to me." And then they brought him to him, and when he saw him, immediately the spirit convulsed him, and he fell on the ground and wallowed, foaming at the mouth.
All right, so evidently Jesus and those three disciples, as they come down from the mountain, they then come upon this scene here where evidently the other 9 and maybe even some other disciples that are not part of the 12 are there, and there's this big crowd assembled together there. And what does it say at the end of verse 14? It says that the scribes are arguing with the disciples. And I'm going to take that to mean as well that means the disciples are probably arguing right back with them. And we notice that the problem here and what's going on here is that there is this parent who has this child who has this demon that was evidently problematic for a very long time. And this is one of those places where we see in graphic detail, and it's really kind of sad to see the way that demons cause real problems for people in their lives in the New Testament. I think sometimes we talk about that because due to the fact that we don't have to deal with demons in the same way that they did in first century times, we maybe just don't think about that on a real practical level, but just think about the suffering that was described here in these verses, and the pain that this child had to go through for it seems like a good deal of his life. And so this father brings this child to the disciples, and evidently the disciples were not able to cast out this demon. Now let's remember back in chapter 6, I believe it was, Jesus had given this power to the disciples. It was one of the things that he enabled them to do, was to be able to cast out unclean spirits and demons, and they had been doing some of that. But evidently they've run up into a demon here, and I don't know that we're to take this to mean that there's like kind of orders and degrees of demons. I don't want to get into a whole discussion of demonology because that's beyond my pay grade. But maybe there are demons that are stronger and more powerful than others. Not entirely sure about that. But they're not able to cast this demon out. And there's a lot of things that we might think, all right, well, is there just, I mean, is this demon just too strong for them? Is there a power failure here on the part of the disciples? What exactly is the problem here? I think Jesus answers what the problem is. Jesus' response there in verse 19, when he says, "O faithless generation, how long am I to be with you? How long am I to bear with you? Bring him to me." I actually think that's a rebuke of the disciples here in this moment, that their faith is not where it needs to be. They've been doing good things, they've been doing great things, but their faith, at least in this moment, was severely lacking. And Jesus calls them out for that, calls them a faithless generation. Maybe the reason that their faith was not as focused and as channeled as it needed to be was because of what they were doing when this problem was brought to them. Because what were they doing? Well, they're arguing with the scribes. Maybe you hadn't been over here arguing about, probably stuff that didn't even really matter, then maybe we could have been able to cast this demon out. And I do think Jesus seems to be implying that they should have been able to do this.
Yeah, it wasn't a problem with God's power. It was a problem of faith. And maybe they even had become somewhat puffed up and doing previous miracles. And
yeah.
They're kind of forgetting to acknowledge, how and by what authority these things are done. And so that's speculative, but there was at least a faith problem there somewhere.
Yeah. Well, let's just grab the remainder of this little section here, verses 21 through 29.
So he asked his father, "How long has this been happening to him?" And he said, "From childhood. And often he has thrown him both into the fire and into the water to destroy him. But if you can do anything, have compassion on us and help us." And Jesus said to him, "If you can believe, all things are possible to him who believes." And immediately the father of the child cried out and said with tears, "Lord, I believe, help my unbelief." And when Jesus saw that the people came running together, he rebuked the unclean spirit, saying to it, "Deaf and dumb spirit, I command you, come out of him and enter no more." And the spirit cried out and convulsed him greatly and came out of him, and he became as one dead, so that many said, "He is dead." But Jesus took him by the hand and lifted him up, and he arose. And when he had come into the house, his disciples asked him privately, "Why could we not cast it out?" So he said to them, "This kind can come out by nothing but prayer and fasting."
All right, so Jesus has this. He then directs his attention to this father, and inquires for more information. And the father's response here, there's a couple things that I really like about what he says, and there's something in here that is lacking a little bit. One of the things that I really appreciate is him saying, doing something for us, helping us. Yes, it's to help this child, but there is this sense of the way fathers feel, and that is, my child's problems are my problems. Help us, please. One of the problems, though, in the things that he says, if you can do anything. If you could possibly help us, if you're able to do this, Lord, that would be wonderful. And Jesus kind of seizes upon that in his response to him there in verse 23 when Jesus says, "If you can." I like how the ESV renders it, kind of sets that off and puts that off in its own set of quotations. He's just repeating what the man says. If you can. Listen, fella, there's no if here. If there's a power shortage, it's not going to be on the divine side of the equation. If there's a power shortage here, it's going to be on the human side of things. There's no if here with God. All things are possible for the one who believes. And that then brings us to this second great thing that the man says, and that is this acknowledgement that his faith personally is not where it needed to be. And I just love the plea here when he says, "Help my unbelief." I do believe, I've got some faith, but I realize that there's some weak spots in there. And I actually think this guy probably describes a lot of us. I know he describes me a lot of times in my life. I believe, not an issue of whether I believe Jesus is the Son of God, or that he was raised from the dead, or any of those sorts of things. But there are moments where I have unbelief, where doubt creeps in. That's one of the great tactics that not great, but it's one of the terrible tactics that the devil uses on God's people. Plants seeds of doubt and unbelief and causes us to question in our mind whether God truly cares about us, or if he's really doing anything to help us. This man asks for help in that department, and And Jesus performs the miracle, drives the demon out, and gives that guy exactly the boost of faith and confidence that he was needing.
Stands to reason that his faith was just immediately busted by the disciples themselves because they couldn't, cast out the demon. And it's probably an important reminder for our ability to bust other people's faith. Even though it doesn't have to be that way. If we show a lack of faith, then that can be faith busting for others as well.
Yeah, that's a strong point, and it's now making me think of moments in my life where I've either audibly or maybe even just kind of with my countenance, I have portrayed doubt and a lack of faith, even in the face of others who maybe were unbelievers, or even to fellow Christians, and how that can end up weakening the faith of others. It's possible that, maybe they had contributed to this man's faith shortage himself. The disciples' question there, as we get ready to close, their question about, well, Lord, why couldn't we cast this out? Jesus' response to them about it can't be driven out by anything but prayer, and I think the New King James included prayer and fasting. Is that correct? I think indicates that, number one, they needed a more tough-minded faith than what they had, but as well that, again, maybe they were diverted and they weren't as locked in as they needed to be to help correct this problem. You guys were over here arguing and fussing. Dad had put in here the kind of Strong's definition of that word, arguing, that how it's used here. If y'all hadn't been all involved in that over here, but if you had really been intensely focused on fixing this, it could have been done. And it makes me think about some of the quote-unquote demons that cause problems for people today. And when I use that term demons, I'm not so much meaning the idea of being actually possessed by a demon, but demons in the sense of the things that the devil does that causes people to be enslaved to sin or to bad habits. This principle carries through the same even today. You think about the person who has been enslaved for a good portion of their life to alcohol. That ain't going to go away by you just, praying a quick little prayer, Lord, help me with that, and all of a sudden it's going to go away. It's going to require like some steadfast praying and maybe even some fasting and some other things where I'm dialed in to taking care of that. The devil, I think he likes people that are, just kind of halfway and are only willing, I would do something. I'll go to church, but, as far as the other aspects of my life, the devil's totally fine with that. But people who are fully committed, I'm going to do everything that I can, and I'm going to invest fully in this, and I'm going to be locked in and focused on getting this out of my life, I think that threatens and that scares the devil. And that's what Jesus needed the disciples to do here, and that's what people today who deal with, like I said, demons of many different sorts, that's what it's going to require, is can't be driven out by anything but prayer and fasting and a seriousness to have it be driven out. That's a good place for us to stop. I'm going to hold the line here as I usually do for a few seconds. You're on the live stream end. Let you all catch up as I'm finishing up here. If there's any other comments, to chime in with those in the chat. Appreciate the comments that have been made this evening. Parting thoughts on this section. Other things that maybe I didn't give you a chance to say.
No, I think we covered it pretty well.
We're gonna mark there as verse 30 to be a place to pick up with next week. I do want to say while we've got our members here online tonight, we want to be in prayer, and I know many of us already are, for our sister Melinda Howard. As of course many of you know, today she went back to Lexington and was going to begin some treatments for cancer that was found on her brain. Started the steroids, I believe, and I think was going to attempt to start doing the radiation. Serious situation. Of course, anytime you're talking about things affecting the brain, that's a big deal. But please be praying for Melinda. Hey, there's Landon, and this is Melinda. It says, I can relate. I believe it, but it gets weak. So we're praying for you, Melinda. Hang in there. We're thankful for the treatments and medicines and things like that are available in our day and time to help with those sorts of things. And you got a whole family of folks that are here for you to help, and we're going to continue to pray not only for you but for Landon and Doyle and the rest of the family as well, as you make your way through this valley. Don't see any other final comments, so we're gonna close there. Hope to be able to see you on Sunday. Those that are the members here at Lakeside. Here in just a moment, I'll put on the screen what's on tap for this Sunday morning in our sermon, and then as well Sunday night in our Bible study. Josh, thank you for joining me tonight. Appreciate you so much, and appreciate you for being with us tonight. Y'all have a good rest of the evening.